Henry Whitaker was used to silence. His farm, tucked deep into the northern ridges of California, had lived and breathed without much change since his wife Sarah died during labor on a snow-heavy night. Since then, Henry had closed every door that led back to the world. His days became rituals, checking cattle, fixing fences, and returning to a house that no longer echoed anyone's voice. For 3 winters, no laughter had touched the kitchen walls. No one had called his name in that familiar whisper. On a December night, when the cold wind danced across bare fields, Henry heard something strange coming from the old barn. At first, he thought it was the wind scraping through loose tin or a lone owl flying low. But the sound came again, faint, broken, like someone breathing through fear. Grabbing a flashlight, Henry pulled on his heavy wool sweater, stepped into his boots, and walked into the night, each step crunching through frozen mud. He opened the barn door and froze. Under the weak yellow beam of his flashlight, a figure emerged, a woman curled up in the hay clutching 2 newborn babies against her chest. Her body shook with cold, clothes damp and stained with dirt. Their eyes met, but she didn't scream. She simply held the babies tighter, as if the world had already taken everything else from her and this was all she had left. Henry stood motionless. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet fear, not for himself, but for the 3 souls in front of him. One of the infants had a faint yet vivid light in their eyes, and Henry, without a word, took off his coat, wrapped it around all 3 of them, and carried them into the main house. That night, while the world slept, a man who no longer believed in miracles witnessed life return, in the forgotten corner of a horse stable. It came in the form of 2 crying infants, and a silent woman who was hiding more than just her name. Henry knelt down, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't blind the trembling woman in front of him. She didn't speak. In the dim light, he saw cracked lips, streaks of dried mud across her forehead, and 2 tiny newborns pressed tightly against her chest, as if they feared the world might devour them the moment she let go. She didn't ask for help. She didn't beg. But in her weary, watchful eyes there was a silent plea. Please, don't send me away. Henry pulled off his heavy coat and gently draped it over the 3 fragile bodies. You can't stay here, he murmured. It's below freezing. The little ones need warmth. She didn't react, but when Henry reached to adjust one of the babies, she instinctively pulled them closer. Motherhood stronger than exhaustion. He understood, said nothing more except, "Come with me. There's fire in the house." The air in the barn was thick with hay and biting cold. When Henry lifted her up, she felt frighteningly light. Too light. She didn't resist. He carried all 3 to the truck. Henry drove the pickup truck back to the house, his hands, once steady from years of guiding tractors and leading horses, now trembling on the steering wheel. The woman was wrapped in his coat, the 2 infants fast asleep against her chest, as if that fragile moment was the only barrier between them and a harsh, unforgiving world. The distance from the stable to the main house was short, but that night it felt endless. Every bump the truck hit seemed to unearth memories Henry thought he had long buried. When they finally arrived, he moved quickly, unlocking the door, lighting the fireplace, grabbing the thickest blanket from the sofa, setting up the reclining chair in the living room, and putting water on the stove for tea. None of it felt familiar anymore. Since Sarah died, he hadn't cared for anyone. But now, every movement felt instinctive, like some long-lost part of him was waking up. He laid them gently on the old sofa by the fire, wrapped blankets around them, and stirred the embers to life. She still said nothing, but her eyes, once alert and defensive, were now simply tired. Henry stood there, watching the stranger and her babies fall into shallow sleep on worn fabric, in a house that had long echoed only with the past. Something, small but real, had just begun. The fireplace crackled in the quiet of the night. Outside, the wind still swept fiercely through bare pine trees, but inside the wooden farmhouse, warmth had begun to seep into the cold corners. Rachel sat slouched on the couch, her eyes half closed, yet alert, arms still wrapped tightly around the 2 newborns swaddled in a worn blanket. Henry sat across from her, saying nothing, asking nothing. He knew it wasn't time. In the soft orange glow of the fire, he could see every line of her exhaustion. The pale skin, the cracked lips, the shadows under her eyes that spoke louder than words. "You need water," he said, voice gentle as wind. Without waiting for her response, he stepped into the kitchen and poured a cup of warm water. When he returned, she had tried to sit up but nearly collapsed. He handed her the cup. She gripped it with trembling hands and drank slowly, as if water had become unfamiliar. "Drink slowly. What's your name?" No answer. "I'm Henry. This is my ranch. You are in my horse stable." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a trembling voice, she said, "I didn't mean to trespass. It's just, I had nowhere else to go." "Do you have anyone? Family? A place to return to?" She gave a faint shake of her head. "Are they your children?" Another pause, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from pain. She gently brushed the little girl's hair with a motion so instinctive it broke something in him. "Lily," she said softly, pointing at the girl. "And the other one?" "No name yet." Henry nodded, asking nothing more. He knew some questions had to wait. He handed her a bowl of soup. She took it slowly, her hand still shaking. The babies began to cry. They were hungry. Rachel tried to adjust to nurse them, but her weakened body made the task difficult. Henry turned away, giving her privacy. "You need rest. And food." She drew in a breath, as if trying to believe him, but her eyes said otherwise. She still looked like someone ready to flee at any moment, like a cornered creature who didn't yet know how to recognize kindness. Henry didn't press. He only nodded, stood, and walked toward the stairs. Before disappearing from the room, he said without looking back, "You're safe here. If you need anything, just ask." There was no reply, but as his footsteps faded, she pulled the babies closer and, for the first time since stepping into this house, she closed her eyes. Exhaustion won, but in that small moment, she allowed herself to sleep. The morning broke with a thin mist clinging to the windows, but inside Henry's farmhouse, the warmth from the fireplace wasn't enough to quiet the rising worry. Rachel had dozed off on the couch, but never deeply. She stirred at every whimper, every twitch from the babies. When Henry brought out a bowl of thin oatmeal, she nodded, trying to soothe the boy, but her eyes were tight with concern. The baby felt warm, too warm. His forehead was flushed, his eyes half-lidded. Henry leaned in, touched the boy's skin. The heat radiated through his fingertips. "He's burning up," he said softly. Rachel didn't reply. She only pulled him closer, as if holding tight was the only way to keep him from slipping away. Something cracked inside Henry. It had been 3 years since he last touched a child, his own son, who never made it into the world. That day, in the back of the ambulance, racing through a snowstorm, he'd held Sarah's hand and promised they'd make it. But they didn't, and from that moment, Henry stopped believing in miracles. Yet here, in the arms of a stranger, was a boy trembling with fever. Not his son, but the ache felt hauntingly familiar. "Do you have a doctor you trust?" Henry asked. Rachel shook her head, eyes glassy. "No one knows I'm here." Henry stood, picked up the phone. "I'll call Nora. She won't ask questions. She just helps." Rachel didn't respond, but for the first time, she didn't object. And when Henry returned to the living room, he saw her gently pressing her forehead to the boy's, a quiet gesture of fear and love. He knew then. This fever wasn't just burning a child's skin. It was scorching through the defenses 2 broken adults had tried to build around their grief. Nora arrived just past noon, carrying her worn medical bag and the quiet wisdom of age. She asked no questions, simply looked at Rachel and the babies, then calmly got to work. Henry noticed the flicker of concern in Nora's eyes when she touched Rachel's arm, where faint bruises still lingered. "This little one is maybe 2 days old," Nora murmured as she dabbed the boy's forehead with a warm cloth. "She needs food, rest, and safety. Without that, none of them will hold on." Henry nodded. "I'm doing what I can." That night, Henry slept on the sofa, his phone in hand. He had saved the numbers for the hospital and the police. but he never made the call. He had a feeling that if he did, Rachel would disappear. And he didn't know why that mattered so much, he just knew that it did. By the second day, she began to speak more. She told him she had left the city with no real direction, just running, but never said from whom. She had walked for hours until she saw the distant lights of the ranch and followed them to the stable. I just needed somewhere dry, somewhere quiet to give birth. You gave birth to them alone? She nodded. Henry tried to hide his shock. No woman should have to give birth alone, especially while injured, with no one to help in the middle of nowhere. You need to stay, at least until your body recovers. Rachel looked at him like it was something impossible to believe. Why? Because I know what it's like to lose a child, and I won't let you go through that. She didn't answer. She just lowered her head. For the first time, tears spilled down her cheeks. And she didn't stop them. Henry stepped out of the room, gently closing the door behind him. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, and somehow, the ranch didn't feel as empty as it once did. The third night began more quietly. The baby's cries had softened, but not for good reason. Lily was still feeding, though weakly, but the boy wasn't. Henry noticed when he saw Rachel sitting too long, cradling the infant to her chest, her eyes staring blankly into the distance, saying nothing. The boy's forehead burned with fever, and his tiny hands no longer moved the way they had before. Henry stepped closer and saw the truth. "He has a fever," he said gently. Rachel didn't respond. She only pressed her lips to her son's forehead and closed her eyes. She looked too exhausted to react. "Nora's coming today. We'll take care of him. He'll be okay." Still, she didn't answer. Henry stepped outside and immediately called Nora, urging her to come as soon as possible. Then, he unlocked a door that had remained shut for years. Sarah's old room. The stale scent of sealed wood made him pause, but he pushed through. Inside, he found what he needed. A humidifier, a soft comforter Sarah had bought when she learned she was pregnant, and a digital thermometer. When he returned, Rachel was soothing a crying Lily. Henry gently took the baby boy and checked his temperature, 102 DGF. Remaining calm, he prepared a warm basin of water and began sponging the baby with a damp cloth to lower the fever. "What's his name?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, looking into her son's face as if seeking the answer from him. "Miguel." Henry smiled, surprised. That was the name he and Sarah had chosen for the baby they never got to meet. Nora arrived shortly after, carrying a bag filled with medicine, syrup, formula, and glucose test strips. She examined Miguel with calm precision and tenderness. "Looks like a mild infection. He needs fluids and close temperature control. I'll leave the meds and come back in the morning." Before leaving, Nora pulled Henry aside onto the porch. "She's on the edge physically and emotionally. She's not sleeping, not resting. You need to make her understand that she's not alone anymore." That night, Henry sat beside the bed, holding Miguel's hand as Rachel finally dozed off, letting out the occasional restless sigh. Lily slept soundly among soft pillows. Henry's gaze often wandered to Rachel's face. In sleep, she looked younger, more fragile, far too fragile for someone who had endured so much. But there was a strength there too, and a fear he knew too well. The next morning, Rachel woke to see Henry dozing upright, still holding Miguel in his arms. The image stopped her. For the first time, she spoke without being asked. He's not the father." Henry opened his eyes, not quite following. "The man I used to work for. His wife gave birth and passed away. They made me care for both babies like they were mine." She paused. "When I found out what he was planning, I ran." Henry remained silent. He didn't know if that was the whole truth, but her eyes didn't lie. He was going to sell the boy, split them up. I overheard it. I couldn't let that happen. What about the real father? "I don't know. I never knew, and I don't want to." Henry said nothing. He gently laid Miguel in the makeshift crib and handed her the bottle Nora had left. "You did the right thing, even if you were scared." Rachel didn't respond, but this time her silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind that let you breathe. In the days that followed, Miguel slowly recovered. The fever broke, his cries grew louder, and there were even fleeting smiles. Rachel ate more regularly, bathed with Nora's help, and began speaking more with Henry. She remained guarded, but she no longer clutched her coat in sleep or startled at every sound. At night, she often stood on the porch, staring at the sky, as if trying to understand where she was and where she might be going. Henry watched from afar. He knew she was still preparing to leave. But he also saw something shifting in her, just as it was shifting in him. Her eyes carried a pain he knew too well, the kind borne by those forced to grow up too fast, who had seen too much and endured too long. And in the hush of those nights, two strangers began to build something neither had expected. The rhythm of the ranch, once monotonous and silent, now changed, filled with the cries of babies, Rachel's soft footsteps on the wooden floors, and the warm scent of home-cooked food drifting once again through the house. That afternoon, after Nora had left and the babies had finally settled, Henry stood in the kitchen staring out the window toward the barn, where it had all begun. The wind still blew, stirring dead leaves across the yard, but now the house was no longer entirely empty. There were breaths here, movements, life. Rachel still slept in the living room, but Henry noticed she never took off her shoes. Even while resting under the blanket he'd laid over her, she lay on her side, ready to spring up at any moment. In the kitchen, he set a mug of peppermint tea on the table. The scent reminded him of Sarah. His late wife had once planted a row of mint behind the house. He poured another cup and brought it to Rachel. When she stirred awake and saw him, she flinched slightly but said nothing. She accepted the tea with both hands, warm, trembling. "You can stay here," Henry said slowly, "until you feel ready to leave." She looked at him longer than ever before, then gave a faint nod, not out of trust, but because, in that moment, she didn't have the strength to refuse kindness. The next day, subtle changes made Henry uneasy. A food truck lingered too long outside his front gate. A ranch hand from a neighboring property stopped by with odd curiosity. And when Henry went into town for more formula, he caught a look from behind the store counter. Part curiosity, part judgment. Small towns didn't need news. They only needed a scent of something unsaid. And now Henry knew that whispers had begun. He returned home, checked the locks, pulled the curtains tighter. In the living room, Rachel was rocking Lily. She glanced up at him, eyes sharpened by instinct. Henry said just one thing: "If someone comes, I'll be the one who answers the door." And for the first time, Rachel nodded without looking away. That morning, Henry was knee-deep in the cattle pen, hands caked with dirt, when he heard the low hum of an unfamiliar engine from the main road. He looked up. A sleek black car, suspiciously clean for this dusty patch of rural land, rolled slowly onto his front drive. It came to a stop. A man stepped out, gray suit, dark sunglasses, a posture too straight for comfort. He carried a leather folder under one arm. Men like that didn't visit these parts, unless something serious brought them. Henry wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over, calm but watchful. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth and emotionless. "Are you Henry Whitaker?" "I'm Henry," he answered, eyes steady on the stranger's frozen stare. "My name's Cliff Maddox. I'm an attorney representing a client in Los Angeles. We're looking for a missing woman, possibly connected to 2 newborn children. We have reason to believe she's been seen in this area." Henry paused for a beat. His heart slowed, each thump like a hammer against his ribs. "I don't know anyone like that," he said firmly, "and even if I did, you'd need a warrant." Cliff offered a tight, unconvincing smile. "We're hoping to avoid escalation. This woman may be in possession of a child belonging to a legal family. There's a very concerned father waiting for news. Then he should take it up with the court." The air between them thickened. Cliff nodded once, slid his sunglasses back on. "If you see her, just let her know. No one runs forever. The truth always finds its way." The car turned slowly, kicking up a trail of dust as it disappeared down the road. Henry stood still. not from fear, but from certainty. Because from that moment on, he knew the quiet on his land was no longer his alone. Rachel sat on the old wooden chair out on the porch, arms wrapped around Lily, who slept quietly on her chest. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue across the open fields behind the house, but her eyes weren't on the horizon. They were on Henry. He sat opposite her, not too close, not too far. A cold cup of coffee rested in his hands. Silence stretched between them, long and dense, as if words themselves were afraid of being spoken. "He became," Rachel said, not meeting Henry's eyes. "I know." Henry nodded. "Cliff Maddox, attorney." She swallowed hard. A tremor ran through her shoulders. "I recognized the name. He came to the house. Just once. After everything happened." Henry didn't interrupt. He knew what was coming shouldn't be broken. Rachel exhaled. "Lily is theirs. I was there when her mother went into labor. But Michael—" She paused, looking down at the small child in her arms. "Michael isn't hers. I didn't get pregnant from love. It was after one night he came into my room, while his wife was still in a coma." Her voice wasn't angry, it was hollow, as if all the tears had dried up long ago. "I tried to leave. I knocked on doors, made phone calls, but he threatened me, said if I told anyone I'd lose Michael." Henry lowered his head, hands clenched, but his gaze remained soft when it met hers. "So you ran?" Rachel nodded. "I didn't steal. I didn't kidnap. I just couldn't let Michael be discarded like something unwanted." There was a long pause. Finally, Henry spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "You did the right thing." Rachel looked up. For the first time, her eyes didn't flinch. In that gaze, there was fear, there was shame, but also a faint glimmer of hope that the person sitting across from her wouldn't walk away. And Henry didn't walk away. He reached out, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "Michael is your son, and here, you don't have to apologize for keeping your child alive." Rachel said nothing, but deep within her, something cracked open, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe she wouldn't have to run anymore. That night, Henry stayed longer in the nursery. He sat beside the makeshift crib, watching Miguel sleep, the tiny hand curled into a fist, as if holding on to something invisible. The child was far too small to carry such a cruel past, and yet it was there, surviving, intact. In the dead of night, with Rachel sleeping in the next room beside Lily, Henry turned on the living room lamp, sat at his writing desk, and pulled an old contact from the drawer. A lawyer he trusted, a quiet man who'd been a longtime friend of the family. Without hesitation, he dialed the number. "I need help. This isn't a typical case, but it's not a crime either." On the other end, the voice replied calmly, "Are you trying to protect someone?" "I'm trying to protect 3 people, and maybe myself too. I'll be there first thing in the morning." Henry hung up and looked out the window. The ranch, once nothing more than dirt and memories, now seemed to breathe in a different rhythm, urgent and alive. He knew what was coming wouldn't be easy, but there was no room for hesitation anymore. If the town started whispering, he'd answer with the truth. If Victor Langston's lawyer showed up again, he'd meet resistance. And if anyone dared call Rachel a thief or a kidnapper, Henry would be the first to testify against it. Because the truth doesn't always arrive in full. Sometimes it comes in fragments, like a woman collapsing in hay with 2 children in her arms. And in that brokenness, Henry knew there was more love in her silence than any lie could ever hold. The next morning, James Adler arrived with 2 cups of coffee and eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. "You called me past midnight. That's a first," he said, gripping Henry's hand firmly. Henry led him inside and told him everything, from the night in the stable to the encounter with Cliff Maddox. He spoke about Rachel, Lily, Miguel, and her late-night confession. James listened without interruption, occasionally scribbling notes into a worn leather notebook. When Henry finished, James sat in silence before finally saying, "If her story is true, and I believe it is, you're not just protecting someone in danger. You're protecting two victims, and possibly preventing something much worse. That man has power. He'll try to silence her, ruin her name. Then we'll need evidence, testimony, medical records, anything that reconstructs the truth. And if he goes to the police? No warrant, no entry. If there is one, we'll be ready, but you'll need to ask her one thing. Is she ready to fight this all the way? Henry said nothing. He knew it wasn't a simple question. Rachel had endured more than most people could bear, and now she might have to relive it all to prove her pain was real. In the kitchen, Rachel was soothing Miguel, who would only sleep in her arms. Lily napped nearby in her stroller. Her eyes were tired, but her face looked calmer. Like confessing to Henry had lifted something off her shoulders. Has he arrived? She asked when she saw the suited man passing by. Yes, that's James and my lawyer. He's not here to prosecute, he's here to help. She nodded, meeting Henry's gaze without flinching. I'll speak with him, just not today. I need one more day. Take all the time you need. That afternoon, while Rachel rested with the children, Henry walked into the room where his father's old piano stood. He hadn't touched it since Sarah died. It sat like a sealed grave for memories. But today, something pulled him toward it. He sat down, brushed dust from the keys, and let his fingers find an old tune. One Sarah used to play while rocking the child they never got to meet. His hands moved gently, like breathing. The notes filled the house. Rachel heard it from the doorway. She stood still, holding Lily in her arms. The music stirred something in her, not pain, but longing. A longing for a home without threat, without fear. A place where presence alone was enough. When he stopped and turned, he saw her there. Do you play? He asked. She nodded. I taught myself. There was an old teacher who let me use a piano at night, but I never played for anyone. Would you like to try? He asked, sliding over. She hesitated, then sat beside him, Lily still nestled in her arms. Her right hand floated over the keys, playing a simple melody laced with feeling. Her left hand cradled the sleepy child. The tune wasn't complex, but it was honest. So quiet, it almost made the world hold its breath. Henry didn't watch her like a man entranced, but like someone recognizing a pain he'd carried too. She's asleep, Rachel whispered, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. He didn't answer. He just stayed there, watching Lily's soft breaths and realizing that what filled his chest wasn't just gratitude. It was the quiet beginning of love. Gratitude that she had walked into his life. Gratitude that somehow he'd been the one to receive them, without knowing he was being chosen. That evening, while Rachel bathed Miguel, Henry sat out on the porch with James. You're in love with her, the lawyer said bluntly. Henry didn't answer. He simply looked up at the sky, where the soft glow of fireflies flickered in the night, and the warm kitchen light cast gentle shadows across the old wooden hallway. It's not about love or not, Henry said slowly. It's just, I can't leave her alone. Too many people already have. James took a quiet sip of his coffee before replying. Sometimes that's exactly what real love looks like. Around midnight, after the house had fallen silent, Henry took a walk around the ranch. He passed the herb greenhouse, the horse stable, and the fig tree where he used to sit with Sarah, talking about names for the baby they never got to meet. He sat down on the cool earth, staring up at the stars. He thought of Miguel, of Lily, of the man who had once tried to tear them apart, of Rachel, a woman shattered yet still standing. And for the first time he thought of the child he lost, not with pain, but with a gentle longing. The grief was still there, but something inside him had begun to shift, like soil after a storm, still damp, still marked, but ready to bloom again. The small courthouse stood beneath a canopy of maple trees, their leaves already tinged gold. Inside, the air was taut with unspoken weight. Everyone present knew how much was at stake. Rachel sat beside her attorney, James Adler. Her hands were clenched, but her eyes held steady. Michael slept soundly behind them in his carrier. Lily was with Henry out in the hallway, He refused to leave the building, but let Rachel walk into the courtroom on her own, an unspoken sign of trust. Cliff Maddox entered in a sharp suit, carrying a smug smile and a sleek leather briefcase. He didn't look at Rachel, only focused on the documents he barely bothered to read. Victor Langston was notably absent. The judge was an older man, sharp-eyed and silent. After James delivered a concise but powerful summary of Rachel's case, the judge listened as Cliff repeated familiar lines, questioning Rachel's legal standing, insisting the children were not hers, claiming a father wished to reclaim his role. "Where is he?" the judge asked. Cliff hesitated. "He's away on business." No appearance, no custody filing, no formal petition, and he held up a set of medical records, clear signs of abuse, coercion, and consistent testimony from a witness. He turned to Rachel. "You endured in silence, but today you stood for 2 lives no one else was willing to see as worthy." He lowered the gavel, voice resolute. "No legal action may be taken against Rachel or the 2 children without a new court order. Emergency protection has been granted. Miguel and Lily are now legally registered under Ms. Rachel's temporary guardianship." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. The room held its breath. Then, quietly, a small sound escaped her lips. A sob, not of sorrow, but of release. On the way back from the courthouse, Rachel said little. She sat in the passenger seat, the late afternoon sun pouring through the window, illuminating a face shaped by broken dreams and hard-won grace. Henry drove in silence, occasionally glancing at her, but letting her thoughts unfold without interruption. Some victories needed silence to be heard. When they arrived back at the ranch, Nora met them at the porch. "Any news yet?" Nora asked gently. Rachel nodded, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm their mother, legally." Nora said nothing. She just hugged her whole, tight and warm like bread still soft from the oven. That evening, Rachel stepped into Henry's small office on the ranch. On the desk were 2 envelopes bearing the court's official seal. She opened the first. Lily's new birth certificate. The name, Lily Brennan. Her hands trembled as she opened the second, Michael Brennan. She stared at those names, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a placeholder in their lives. She was their mother. No permission needed, no hiding. Henry walked in quietly, standing behind her for a moment before asking, "How does it feel?" Rachel smiled, not broadly, but truthfully. "Like I finally got to name my own dream." That evening, Rachel cooked dinner. Henry played with Lily on the rug in the living room. Miguel lay in his crib, beginning to make small sounds, as if he had just discovered his own voice. The old house, with its crooked table corner and peeling walls, had become a home, with the smell of simple food, the patter of small feet, and the quiet presence of people who no longer wanted to leave one another. And in that home, the truth was no longer a burden, it was a release. The weeks that followed moved to a new rhythm, softer, steadier. No more strange cars pulling into the drive, no more strangers knocking at the door. Rachel began to walk around the house without looking over her shoulder. Henry renovated the room that had remained locked since Sarah's passing. He and Rachel changed the curtains, swept away years of dust, and painted the walls in soft, calming tones. 2 cribs were placed beside the large window overlooking the fields. Lily started pulling herself up, laughing as she gripped the rails. Miguel loved lying in the morning sun, babbling to the sky as if in conversation. Rachel discovered she had a knack for caring for plants. She tended the greenhouse as if reviving a part of herself. In the quiet evenings, she would play the piano, her own compositions, full of pauses and emotion. Sometimes Lily sat beside her, slamming random keys. Miguel would wave his hands to the rhythm. Henry simply sat and listened, saying nothing, feeling, perhaps for the first time, that he had found a place that had always existed, yet he'd never known until now. James continued to visit regularly, keeping track of the legal progress. The case against Victor Langston was moving forward thanks to the evidence and testimony gathered. Cliff Maddox had withdrawn from the matter. No one came to disturb them anymore. What afternoon the rain came, gentle, not fierce. as if the sky was washing away the last lingering wounds. Rachel ran out to the porch with Lily in her arms, and Henry followed, carrying Miguel. The four of them stood together, watching raindrops roll down the tiled roof, the scent of damp earth rising, the breeze carrying the quiet promise of a new beginning. "This might be the first rain of our new life," Henry said softly. "Maybe. It's the world saying thank you," Rachel replied, resting her head on his shoulder. Her eyes no longer searched for threats, but for things beginning to grow. A home had been built from scars that turned into tenderness, from silence that became presence. Two adults who once only knew how to run had now learned how to stay, with themselves and with each other. That evening, Henry lit a fire in the hearth. Rachel brought out a soft blanket. Lily slept on the couch, her legs draped over Henry's. Miguel rested peacefully in his mother's arms, his breathing rising and falling with the crackling of the flames. They didn't speak of the future, made no promises. They just sat, whole and present. And for the first time in a very long time, both of them knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. 2 years passed like a blink. Lily could now tie her shoes, and Michael constantly asked why the sky was blue. The ranch echoed with laughter, tiny footsteps, and in every corner there was the imprint of a real family. Rachel taught the kids to bake. Henry took them riding every weekend. Both children called him Dad without anyone ever prompting them. It didn't come with a ceremony. It grew naturally, like grass after rain. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Henry brought Rachel to the small plot where they once planted mint. There were 2 wooden chairs, a jar of wildflowers, and a simple ring in his hand. "You once said this place felt like home," he began. "The kids taught me what it meant to be called Dad. But I'm still missing one thing, being called your husband." Rachel didn't speak, just nodded, eyes wet with the kind of joy that only comes after surviving something unbearable. The wedding was held in the garden. Simple, warm, perfect. Nora baked the cake, Lily scattered petals like she'd been waiting her whole life to do it, and Michael got lost carrying the rings, but found his way back in time for "I do." And when Henry said his vows, Rachel looked at him like time had stopped, because every pain of the past had now become soil, and they were the seeds that grew from it.